This videocast is a walk and talk through my plan to an A-level question from the Edexcel Germany 1871 to 1990 specification. The question is, a quote, "The consequence of Hitler's leadership style was that he was a dictator who did not dictate." How far do you agree with this statement? Okay, so as always, the question analysis is key. So just zoom in and have a look more closely at this question. Remember, it's important. The plan must derive directly from the question. Not from your notes, so you mustn't be thinking, what have I learned on this particular topic, and then try to squeeze everything into your answer to the question. Certainly that was a feature, it's a common weakness with this type of question. It's sort of like trying to sort of bang a square peg into a round hole. It's very important. You've only got limited time here. It's very important to keep your answers sharply focused on the question, and therefore your plan must derive from the actual question. So how do we do this? So let's look at the different components, the different elements of the question. Clearly, the starting point of the question is Hitler's leadership style. Okay, so there needs to be a clear statement, and you'll see this in the plan that follows. It's the very first building block, but there needs to be a clear statement of what Hitler's leadership style was, and to show detailed knowledge of that. Secondly, the question is about the consequences of Hitler's leadership style. So there's got to be a clear focus on the outcome of his leadership style. So you start by talking about the leadership style, and you've got to then move into the consequences. And you're given a proposition, okay, which is challenging you to weigh up how convincing the proposition is. And the proposition is, he was a dictator who did not dictate. And there's two elements to that proposition. The first element of the proposition, one, is that he was a dictator. So that needs weighing up. Was he actually a dictator? And the second proposition is that he was a dictator who did not dictate. So the second proposition is presenting to you the fact that as a result of Hitler's leadership style, he did not give clear direction. He did not make decisions. But you are asked, how far do you agree with that statement? So therefore, for both proposition 1 and 2, you need to weigh up the argument and the counter argument. Okay, so immediately you can therefore almost see the building blocks to your answer. You don't need to be planning from your notes. You should be planning from your analysis of the question. So as you'll see, and you can download my answer from the usual place. As you can see, there are 4 building blocks to my particular answer. The first building block is the introduction, and then there are 3 other building blocks that come from the plan. So let's go into the different building blocks for this question. Okay, so building block 1, okay, then is about Hitler's leadership style. I said this is pretty much your introduction. You've got to show the examiners straight away that you have knowledge and understanding about the topic of the question. And the topic of the question is Hitler's leadership style. Remember also that the specification is about the years 1933 to 35. Slight weakness in the sense here of the wording of the question. It would have been good if they put the years 1933 to 35 into the question, but you do know that the specification is about a new Reich 1933 to 35. So therefore, play it safe, keep your answer focused on those years. Okay. So in particular, show knowledge that Hitler's leadership style was not simple and it was not fixed. Okay, this is A level. Whenever you're given a date range, don't assume that everything was the same within those date ranges. Okay, that's true with any question at A level. You can always chunk it into smaller periods. You've got to demonstrate knowledge, the fact that things were not static. So his leadership style did change, with a fairly conventional style in the first 12 months, 1933, and thereafter a less conventional style. So examples. Now, throughout this answer, I've put examples in italics. That's basically saying this is where you've got to show precise knowledge, okay, and it's got to be date focused, and it's got to have names, and it's got to have details in it. Okay, so in the first year, 1933, Hitler followed a fairly conventional leadership style, attending cabinet meetings. Now, I haven't put any statistics in there, but you could look those up. There are actually published statistics of how many cabinet meetings, and I think they're in your notes, of how many cabinet meetings he attended early on, and how far fewer cabinet meetings there were as you move into the second year of his rule, 1934. So he worked in the capital city, Berlin, which gave him access to ministers and organs of the state machinery. And of course, the state chancellery was headed by Hans Lammers. So that's the sort of detail you've got to get into. You've got to show precise detail in your introduction. Another example, from 1934 onwards, his leadership style changed. He spent more time in the Berghof, in the Bavarian Alps. You could also add near the village of Berchtesgaden. Again, details are crucial. Unconventional working hours. He rarely read or signed official documents, and he was accessible only by the party leaders and his personal favourites, e.g. Albert Speer. I haven't put all the details in. Okay, this is not a detailed word-for-word plan, but it's saying to you, it doesn't matter what the details are, this is just indication of the type of detail, but there must be supporting detail at every turn. This move to an unusual leadership style does not sit comfortably with the propaganda image of an omniscient, of an all-powerful, in other words, dictator of a totalitarian state. So there's the debate. That's opening it up for you. It's saying, look, clearly Hitler's leadership style was changing, but it was also moving towards an unconventional style, and that does not sit comfortably with the image that historians picked up at the end of World War II, when historians first started writing about the Third Reich. They fell victim to the propaganda machine, and they assumed that because the image was of a monocratic totalitarian system, and Hitler stood at the head of it, that therefore he was in clear control of it. But of course, it's not that simple, okay? Because we then try to square the circle there with this very strange leadership style, and it doesn't sit comfortably with that. Right, so move into the second building block. So the second building block then is teasing around this question: did Hitler have the power to dictate? Okay, because the quote in the question says he was a dictator. Well, was he a dictator? We just need to show knowledge of that. Don't spend long on this, but of course this is in itself an area for discussion. Was he actually a dictator? Did he actually have the power to dictate? Of course, legally speaking, he was a dictator. Okay, and of course that power was given to him by the Enabling Act of 23rd of March 1933, which enabled him to pass laws without the Reichstag. And that power was bolstered by enormous popular support. The National Uprising election campaign, of course, played a key part in that, validated by popular plebiscites. Remember, there were 5 of them between 1933 and 1938, where the German people were called out to vote yes or no to did they agree with things that Hitler had achieved. And that, of course, was validating Hitler's popularity. It was an opportunity to present himself to the people as a leader who was doing good for Germany, in which the key organs of control, okay, so I've listed 5 of them there. 1, the police; 2, the working classes, 3, to the DAF, etc., 3, the political parties. Germany became a one-party state. 4, the media. Okay, the media was coordinated, and of course the federal states, they were effectively abolished and centralized. So those key organs, the basis of his dictatorship, of his power, were coordinated, Gleichschaltung, and that happened, remember, astonishingly quickly in the spring and summer of 1933. Now, you haven't got time in this essay to literally write more than 1 or 2 sentences on that. Notice how I've captured those key points there in literally 1 sentence. You've got to show knowledge, but what you've got to do at A-level is you've got to condense and be very succinct where necessary. Don't embellish and expand on areas that you haven't got time to. The point needs to be made that Hitler was a dictator legally, with some knowledge, but don't extend that point. Secondly, nevertheless, even in the early months in which Hitler's leadership style was more conventional, his power was constrained. So again, make it relevant, okay? You're keeping it reined in. Show the examiner that you're not straying away from the question. In the early months of Hitler's rule, his leadership style was conventional. It was based in Berlin. He attended meetings of the cabinet, etc. Even in these early years, his power was constrained. Okay, so practicalities forced him to keep conservatives in office. He had to restrain the ambitions of the party activists until he'd resolved that long drawn-out issue of Hindenburg and the army that was finally resolved in June 1934 with the Night of the Long Knives. And I've just given those examples there. Economic recovery, 1. Secondly, foreign policy revisionism. And thirdly, restoring law and order. So the point you're making there is that Hitler's power, his ability to dictate, and I use those key words, was limited by the practicalities of what it had to achieve in those early months, okay, which was economic recovery, revisionism of the Treaty of Versailles, and restoring law and order. Okay, then move on to the third building block. So, having clearly established what Hitler's leadership style was in building block 1, and having clearly established that Hitler did have dictatorial powers in building block 2, albeit he had to moderate that to some extent, you can now clearly move in to the consequences of Hitler's leadership style, which is the main thrust of the question. So the point is building blocks 1 and 2 really should not be more than probably about a quarter of the length of the essay. It's really the introduction, like an extended introduction. Now it's getting into the real meat of the answer, okay? So let's just go through the points. So building block 3 is evidence that Hitler's leadership style caused him not to dictate. So here you're actually agreeing with the proposition. You're presenting evidence that supports the proposition that's put across in the question. Okay, so point number 1. From the outset, Hitler delegated key powers to other leaders, okay, who were often conservatives, not Nazis, and he let them get on with the job. And Hitler showed remarkable disinterest in the details of their decisions. So the best example of that is obviously Schacht, who was made Minister of Economics in 1934, with the brief to create work. Huge powers were given to him. Other examples include von Neurath, who was Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Fritsch, the Commander-in-Chief of the Army. Now, none of those were sort of card-carrying members of the Nazi Party. They were all conservative nationalists. Powerful people who had been there before Hitler took power in 1933, who kept their jobs, and Hitler allowed them to keep their jobs in order to channel the revolution into evolution and stability. So it's clear evidence that Hitler was not directly dictating policy. He was letting other people get on with their job and make the decisions on his behalf. Secondly, Hitler's geographical isolation from the capital city, so working a long way from Berlin, and his unconventional working hours, his disinterest in paperwork, meant that the consequence, Hitler was often poorly informed. So Hitler was having to make decisions on the basis of weak information or no information. Best example of that, Walter Richard Darré, the Minister of Agriculture, was unable to meet Hitler during the whole of this period, 1933 to 35. We know that it really frustrated Darré. He tried to get to see Hitler, but effectively his access was blocked, largely because Hitler was not that interested in agricultural matters. What were the consequences of this disinterest, this distancing? There is some evidence that Hitler's decisions were watered down by subordinates or even ignored by subordinates. Now, again, in italics, I've given precise examples, which is what you've got to do with names and dates, and show how this played out in terms of decision making. So there's a very famous example, first put forward by Kershaw in the 1980s. It happened in October 1934, where Robert Ley, the leader of the DAF, the German Workers' Front, persuaded Hitler on the basis of inaccurate information, very biased information that he presented to Hitler. He persuaded Hitler to authorize the expansion of the DAF. So it was a blatant bid by Ley to get more power for his own organization. Now, Ley used that subsequently to expand the DAF time and time again at the expense of big business, because the DAF represented the workers. That's something Hitler did not want, but Ley effectively used that authorization to undermine Hitler's goals. So it's a famous example of how Hitler could make mistakes, and it often worked against Hitler. Next, another very famous example, the Nuremberg Laws, which were the key laws against the Jews, passed in September 1935. Now, these laws were passed at the same time as Hitler. He always went to Nuremberg every September to do a big speech at a party rally. And Hitler had a big speech planned, a keynote message, which at the last minute he had to cancel, and suddenly he lacked a central message for his speech. And there's a good section in Noakes and Pridham where they explain how, given that moment of weakness and indecisiveness, Hitler was looking for an agenda item. Gauleiter Wagner approached him, and it was Wagner's suggestion to Hitler, why don't you pass a law to restrict the rights of German Jews? Now, the law that was passed, Nuremberg Laws, which effectively removed their citizenship law, and it forbade German Jews from having sexual relations or marrying non-Jewish Germans. That law is the most famous law in the 1930s that the Nazis passed against the Jews. Well, the evidence is it was actually prompted and decided not by Hitler, but it was decided by an ambitious subordinate, Gauleiter Wagner, who was looking effectively to get access to Hitler and to get influence from Hitler. And he succeeded. Well, you could argue that's evidence of Hitler not dictating policy, other people dictating policy. So it's a good example that you could use. Okay, that's building block 3. Let's move on then to building block 4. Oh, no, sorry, we haven't quite finished building block 3. There we go, we've got some more points. Okay, so point number 4. So we're still arguing the case that Hitler did not dictate. Historians also now know, remember that thing about hindsight, we now know that Hitler's distance and lack of direction caused the Nazi regime to be chaotic, polycratic, which means lots of overlapping competencies, different agencies, some party, some state, some neither, plenipotentiaries, remember, use the correct terminology, all competing against each other, which created enormous confusion as to which organisation was in control or which individual was in control. And we do now know that the fact that Hitler was not on the spot in Berlin to make decisions as to who was in control certainly would have contributed towards this confusion. Fifthly, further evidence of not dictating. Hitler throve on mass popular support and was very, very anxious to protect his image and his status. And that sometimes led him to make poor decisions, or it sometimes led to inaction, no decision making at all. So again, evidence, I put them in italics for you. You've got to give precise examples at every turn. So obviously the most famous example of that is it took Hitler a full year to resolve the issue of the SA, and that he was forced into eventually making a decision by von Papen, a non-Nazi, who basically made that speech at Marburg University on the 17th of June 1934, which was pretty much an implicit threat to Hitler that if you don't resolve the issue of the SA, you will lose conservative backing. And that worried Hitler, and Hitler, as a result of that, made the decision to purge the SA leadership 2 weeks later. Another good example of this is the historian Tim Mason famously argued that Hitler's decision to go to war against Poland in September 1939 was a reactive decision to declining working class morale, and in order to bolster Hitler's own popular support, Hitler made the decision to go to war against Poland earlier than planned, because a plunder economy accessing the assets of Poland would take the pressure off an overheating economy at that key moment. So it's another example. Building block 4 then. Okay, so you now move into the counter-argument that Hitler was in control in spite of that unconventional leadership style. So we're arguing the counter-argument here. So as you can see, there's a series of 5 different points. Firstly, there is evidence that that chaotic polycratic structure was deliberate, in line with Hitler's social Darwinist ideology. Try to use that word Weltanschauung, which is the German word for worldview, Hitler's ideology. So what was this worldview? Well, Hitler deliberately promoted internal struggle to weed out the inefficient and promote the strong. An example of that would be there was a struggle as to who would take over the policing of Germany between 1933 to 35. Initially Frick as the Minister of the Interior, then Goering as the lead Nazi in the Prussian government, and then Himmler, the leader of the SS. Now, they all fought against each other, different Nazis, to take control over policing, but ultimately it was Himmler who won that particular turf war. Secondly, that's one, and number 2, there is also evidence, in spite of the surface chaos, that Hitler was always setting the wider agenda, steering policy in the right direction through timely interventions and decisive interventions. Okay, so although he may seem to be not doing much, when he did intervene, it had impact. So, e.g., Hitler's decision to purge the SA leadership in June 1934, taken after a year of indecision, had astonishing impact. It worked. Another example, Hitler's intervention in September 1935 over the drafting of the Nuremberg Laws, okay, maybe prompted by Wagner, but nevertheless, when Hitler did intervene, he controlled the agenda, and he actually chose the most moderate four draft versions of the law. The radicals, including Wagner, who were persuading him to introduce the law, wanted a more radical version of it. Hitler steered it towards a more moderate version. So Hitler, therefore, was dictating the pace. Okay, he was in control. Hitler's decision to sideline Schacht in the mid-1930s. Schacht had now served his purpose. He'd led economic recovery, and Hitler decided effectively to promote Goering as plenipotentiary of the four-year plan. That again was Hitler's intervention after seemingly 2 or 3 years of not showing interest in the economy. Now Hitler steps in and makes a decisive decision. Thirdly, there is also convincing evidence, first shown by the historian Mommsen, of what we call cumulative radicalization. And that's the process in which leading Nazis worked towards the Führer in their own decision-making, which meant that policy invariably moved in the direction of Hitler's intentions, without Hitler having to do anything. Certainly worth, on that one, referencing that famous primary source, the fairly low-ranking official in the agricultural ministry called Werner Willekens, Willikens, first name Werner, Werner. Look it up. It's talked about in Noakes and Pridham. I'm sure you can Google it. But he was the primary source who used that phrase, working towards the Führer. Again, that's good knowledge which you can use for that key point, which is evidence of the fact, although through doing nothing, Hitler was in control. Fourthly, the historian Richard J. Evans has convincingly shown in his book, The Coming of the Third Reich, that Hitler's erratic lifestyle is not evidence of laziness, as others have argued, and that in fact he often worked intensely hard with enormous impact, especially in those key areas that mattered to him: foreign policy, military matters, racial policy, with long spells of apparent inactivity in between. But nevertheless, when he did intervene, it had incredible impact. It steered policy in the right direction. And also, Evans points out that you can over-egg that point that Hitler wasn't interested in detail. In the areas that Hitler was interested in, he had an astonishing recall for the tiniest details, especially military matters. And the most experienced, highest-ranking army officers could not match Hitler in conversations. Hitler literally knew everything down to the tiniest detail, down to the tiniest measurements of bullets and guns, etc. Hitler had everything memorized. Okay, so be very careful not to sort of overstate that point that Hitler was not interested in detail. Finally, the argument that Hitler was weak because he promoted leading Nazis into huge power bases which they could use against him can be challenged by the fact that all his subordinates were astonishingly loyal to him, even in the later years when the regime faced impending defeats. Let's just unpick that one a little bit. Okay, so there is an argument, which would be an argument of weakness, that because Hitler gave so much power to Nazis like Himmler and Goering and Goebbels, he gave them these power bases, that he effectively created mini Hitlers. And the argument is that therefore was Hitler not dictating, he was letting other people make decisions on his behalf. And that was potentially exposing him to weakness, because by promoting these powerful Nazis, they could arguably use their power bases against Hitler, ultimately to overthrow Hitler. Well, that's a hypothetical argument. The point here is the counter-argument is that these people had huge power bases, but it worked. Hitler, they were always loyal to him. So that loyalty was part of the basis of Hitler's astonishing power. So, point number 4. So that's the fourth point. So, conclusion. The safest conclusion is that Hitler often did not dictate, yes, and that this was certainly a consequence of his leadership style, yes. So we're, to an extent, agreeing with the proposition. But, teasing beneath it, digging into it, this did not mean weakness or lack of control, and certainly not in areas that mattered most to Hitler, because the picture is complex and changing. Hitler's leadership style, for starters, was not fixed. It was changed over, and it changed over time, as we established in the introduction. In some areas, for example, labour relations, agriculture, yes, there is evidence that Hitler's distant leadership and lack of direction may have had a negative impact. It may have meant lack of control. But in significant areas that mattered to Hitler, especially racial policy, foreign policy and military affairs, Hitler was fully in control, even though maybe that control was based on inaction, the cumulative radicalization argument, or spells in which he apparently seemed to do very little, with very, very decisive intervention to keep policy on the right track. So the answer is a sort of amalgamation of the two arguments, but you have reached a definite conclusion yourself. Okay, so there we go. That's the answer. That's my approach to that particular question. I hope that was useful to you.